Well, were you living in Brazil during that?
So I was living from 2016 onwards. Yeah.
Oh, so you were there.
So I was here for and caught the tail end of what had been a mass mobilization of the left, but not even necessarily subconsciously of the left, but which made social demands, social and democratic demands. So it was at least incipiently like left wing or left oriented. And that burst out in 2013. It was the biggest protest movement ever in Brazil's history. 2 million people across the streets over months, and which continued into the World Cup the following year, and protests around the building of these mega stadia and whatever. And then by 2015, 2016, that is explicitly right wing, like turned against the Workers' Party, and ends up leading to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. So I was there for the kind of second act of that, the second or third act, yeah.
You were there for you get there for the kind of the right wing turn, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been following it from abroad, but of course, when you're actually here and you see it on the streets and you feel it in the atmosphere, then it's an entirely different thing.
What's interesting, so we had Vincent Bevins on the show, and I have to thank you for that because I had emailed him, never got back. You sent the homie bat signal out, and I got
the bunga signal. It's like
yeah, I appreciate that. That's what friends are for. And he had, again, I don't know how many books Vincent sold with the Jakarta method, but I felt like more people really loved the Jakarta method more than If We Burn. And I really hope If We Burn sells like a jillion copies because it's a very important book, as is the Jakarta method. But there is no secret underlying CIA co-optation with a lot of these, and there's so many people that want to, there's a government deep state spook operation pulling the strings. A lot of this is just kind of pointing the finger at maybe a failed strategy. Is that hard for people to swallow?
I mean, so my immediate instinctive answer is a kind of psychological one, and I know that's probably wrong, or you shouldn't do that, but there is people who decide that they're on the left, I think in many ways are motivated by a sense of injustice. And that's pretty fundamental. And it's like you have this idea that you have people in power and they're bad in some way.
Yeah.
Whether that's structural or whether in the worst case scenarios in a very fetishistic way understood as being them somehow, constitutionally somehow bad or evil, and therefore against your interest, but whatever, in one way or the other, the world is run by people who are bad or doing bad things, and there's just a wave of injustice, and we want to fight the good fight. And I think there's a kind of always a temptation towards being the glorious loser, which I think is not a good kind of disposition for politics. And people on the right, to a certain extent, have this a little bit, because there's the kind of lost causers from the, people who wave the Confederate flag all the way through to kind of contemporary Trumpers or various forms of kind of, right populists or national populists who also like to play victim, because unfortunately victim politics is now entirely cross spectrum. Everyone wants to be a victim.
That's a whole show, brother.
That is a whole show. But it's important here because I think the left does have this. The left kind of started it, I have to say, of wanting to be the victim because they want to speak for the victim, but also be the victim. And there are any number of tragedies. And Vincent's book about the massacre of 1 million people in Indonesia and the way that kind of completely destroyed any prospect of revolution. And indeed even of reform in Indonesia, something we covered on our podcast quite recently again, is something which is like obviously very effective, but also writes the left kind of out of the story, right? It ultimately there's nothing really you can do about that other than scream about injustice. But there's no one to appeal to. There is no one in charge. There's no daddy or ombudsman or judge or whoever to whom to appeal to say this was wrong, we want restitution. There is no one. And sometimes maybe we forget that and therefore are too happy to be screaming about injustice rather than actually trying to think, okay, well, the critique should be turned at the left. There's no point really critiquing the right. They're not going to be unlikely to be very swayed by moral arguments. So we need to be critiquing ourselves. And we should be unstinting and pretty brutal in our critique of ourselves and what we do, in a way, as a way to seek to do better, which is a bit of a trite way to put it, but as a way to kind of rethink our politics, and in terms of effectiveness, and then think of like, what do we actually want and how do we get there?
I mean, look, what you're talking about is even hard for people to do on a personal level, right? There's $1 billion industry on, not looking at yourself in the mirror, but having better words to call other people names, to not look at yourself in the mirror and say, maybe I'm the problem.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult thing to do. And I think these books that we're talking about do an amazing job of it. I'll put a link to all the books on this show, so you guys can check them out for yourselves. I haven't read Yeager's book yet, but because of our relationship with Sublation and Patrons, and again, I loved Bevan's book. Usually for these shows, we read, or I do read as much of the book as possible before the guest gets on, and then I have to move on to another book because we have so many guests. But that's one I went back and finished, and then read the conclusion again. Highlighted a bunch of it. Very, very important book.